I got this question from Yasmin in Beirut, asking me how should young people her age, she says are like Gen Z, millennials, cope with what's going on in Beirut and in the Lebanon at the moment. She told me that after the bomb, young people were trying to help out, that the army was around and was mocking them for trying to help clean up houses, and said that they were basically playing. She said that the feeling there is that the government isn't doing anything, and when they protested, that they were shot with rubber bullets by the government. And she said, she asked, how are we supposed to cope with this? How are we supposed to deal with the PTSD and the CPTSD of this? So, from my understanding of how these things take place, when human beings go through stress, we have defense mechanisms that kick in, reaction formations they call them in psychoanalysis. So you have the wounding, and then at the psychic level it's kind of like a scar tissue that builds up around the wound, and that scar tissue then takes on a life of its own. And at some point you end up having to look at what the narrative is that you're living with. So obviously within this story, you've already told me there's a battle of different narratives. There's people saying that this is where the bomb came from, that this is why it happened, and then there's counter narratives to that, which all takes place at the political level to suit a certain agenda, and they are made defensively. There is a trauma that goes against my political party's narrative, so I form a counter narrative to deal with that. And a lot of these things are done ad hoc, and they're done to justify a previously held position. So they've already decided what they're going to do. They've already decided what they want, and then whatever happens, there's no real, this is how narcissistic personality disorder functions, there's no real sort of taking on board of fresh data and of fresh feedback and then responding to it authentically. Whatever happens is absorbed into the pre-existing narrative so that they keep doing what they're already planning on doing anyway. In this case, according to Yasmin, a lot of the government officials were doing not much of anything at all. So I can't really speak to that because I'm not an expert on that subject. I'm not an expert on the area, but I can speak to what happens with individuals. You know, there's a level of trauma that occurs when bad things happen, of course. And then there's an extra level of trauma that occurs when we see how the environment responds or doesn't respond to that trauma. So you would think, oh, the adults should do something about this. The people who are in positions of authority should do something about this, and then they don't. That's trauma. So there's the pain of what initially happens, then there's the pain of how the environment responds or doesn't respond to what happens. And as I say, at some point, you will develop a narrative. It's not a question of, oh, I'll choose not to develop a narrative. I won't tell myself a story of what's happened. You will develop a narrative, and you will live and die by that narrative. We all do with trauma. So be careful. All I would say is be careful to you, to your friends, to the young people who feel that sense of having been abandoned, of feeling that frustration, of feeling that insecurity about their future and their national sovereignty. The more extreme the trauma, the initial primary trauma of the bad thing that happens, then the secondary trauma of how people respond or don't respond to it, the more extreme the narrative will be. The more extreme our narratives become in reaction, formation, commensurate with and proportionate to the trauma that's delivered to us. So there's a level of it's like a psychic defense. It's a psychological defense. A terrible thing has happened. Now I need to tell a story to myself and to others that deals with what's going on. And it's not a question of truth. It's not a question of objective, rational reality. It's a question of the narratives we choose to live by, because I believe that we, not in some vague, poetic, metaphysical sense, but in a very practical, day-to-day sense, we live inside of stories. So the story that you and your friends and the young people living through this adopt is going to shape your future. The person to study for this in the psychoanalytic tradition is Adler. Adler developed a way of doing psychoanalysis that was based on a German philosopher who came up with the idea of as if. And what he was suggesting, the German philosopher, whose name escapes me right now, I think it's Rainer or Raymer, was that humans never live naively. They never live literally. We live as though things are true. We live as if it were true. And we very rarely interact with actual reality. And when we do, we find it enormously stressful and traumatic and terrifying. It creates existential dread. So we live as if things are true, which means that we create fictional narratives of who we are and how we're living. These are defense mechanisms. This is the psychic scar tissue. These are reaction formations. It means that all, in my view, and other people who share this position, all human stories are stories rooted in trauma. They're all reactions to pain, all of them. All of our mythology is a reaction to pain, to suffering, to trauma. So choose your stories wisely, because the story that you choose today for this trauma now is the story that you'll be living inside of for your lifetimes, which is decades to come. You will possibly hand that story over to your children, so they'll live with it for generations to come. And these stories that are ongoing, we see become hard, become rigid, and then people live, die, and are then killed in certain situations because of the story. Because of trying to go outside of the story, that can mean death. Because of trying to deny the existence of the story, that can mean death. So be careful. Be very careful now. When things have just happened, as the bomb blast has just happened, we're still in shock. You guys will still be in shock. So the first response is going to be the most primal response. That will be freeze. We'll go, ooh, shock. What does this mean? Then, unless there is a lot of very conscious work done, you're likely to move into another one of the 4 primal responses, which will be to flight, to run away, to fight, to find somebody to kill in response, or to fawn, to submit and to negotiate, but neurotically, from a place of unconscious compulsion, not from conscious choice. How do we avoid all of that? I'm going to sound like that guy. I'm going to sound like that counselor guy. We individually and collectively have to process our grief. We individually and collectively have to process our trauma without missing out pieces of the story. So you have the narrative that you choose, and you will not experience it as a choice. I'm talking in the realm of the unconscious now. This is from the psychoanalytic tradition. This is Adler, Jung, and Freud. You won't consciously choose to say, okay, this is the story we live. It will seem as though that's the only story there is. And you go, that's the story. This is it. You won't consciously choose it. So you've got to be careful of the story that is chosen, but it seems to be unconscious. And you have to be careful of the parts of the story that are left out. That's a Jungian concept. That means that they're in the shadow. The parts of the story that are left out become the shadow. When a nation lives by a certain narrative and it misses parts of its own story out, that becomes the collective unconscious of a nation. The collective unconscious of a nation can get very stinky, very swollen, very infected, and then the demons of that unconscious of a nation, of a culture, can come back to repossess it. This is more Jung now than Adler. So we must be aware of this. You've got to process your grief. You've got to process your trauma, and you have to tell, when you're processing grief and you're processing emotions, you have to embrace all of the emotions that are there, all of the truth of what has happened as best as you can. A discipline of rigorous honesty with yourself is very, very important. Moving forward, choose the narrative moving forward very, very carefully. Trauma like this, like a bomb, reverberates out, and the effects of an explosion can never be fully predicted to within a nicety. It's like inviting chaos itself, raw chaos, into this reality. It opens Pandora's box. Violence spills out. Nobody can predict where those violent forces will end up. So I would say try, if you can, at an individual level, yourself, Yasmin, not to go into a primal response to this event and to these series of ongoing events. Try to keep processing the grief and processing the trauma. Don't suppress things and put them in the collective unconscious, either in your individual unconscious to be dealt with later by the shadow, or they'll come out of the shadow and repossess you, or into the collective unconscious of the national identity and the national culture, because they'll come back to consume you. No good ever comes of that. No good ever comes of suppressing either truths or emotions. They always come back to repossess us later on. The way that I recommend that people deal with trauma is to get very, very specific about the specific emotions they are feeling, and to lend them words, to be emotionally as literate as possible about everything we're feeling in the moment, to avoid emotional illiteracy. When people become emotionally illiterate and they're going between a freeze response into a flight, fight, or fawn response with no emotional literacy, bad things result. There's bad, always bad, at the end of that road. No good is ever going to come from that. So that's probably as much advice as I can offer you with that. I hope that it's useful. As ever, thank you everybody for your time and for your attention, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Cheers.